This is the word of God. No, that's my letter.
Yeah. Here we are, First Corinthians. We're starting in Acts chapter 18. This is when Paul finally gets to Corinth, and then we're also getting a little bit of the letter called First Corinthians, which, fun fact, First Corinthians was actually written after Second Corinthians. More on that later. So this, Reverend Thorne, welcome, the Word Made Fresh. Let's talk about your sermon. You got some good texts here. What are you thinking when it comes to these texts, and maybe just what's going on? Anything we need to kind of focus on with these two? The lectionary gives us two texts, Acts and First Corinthians.
Yes, indeed. So this is the early church, and I love that we get to spend a nice chunk of time seeing how they figured themselves out. Corinth was definitely a church probably after my own heart because they're so troubled, right? There's so much conflict. They're so human. We can definitely see
Yep.
ourselves and our churches in the things happening in that particular book. I believe this letter was written in response to another letter, and it's dealing with conflict. It's ironic that that love chapter is in Corinthians,
That's
and we're
next
going to
week.
talk
Don't
about
give any
that's next week.
spoilers.
That's next week. But it's a great letter. Trying to help people be community together, and I'm playing with this idea of what it means to be church and what the rough edges of that looks like after the resurrection. So we've had this thrilling, Easter story, everyone's, arm in arm, and you thinking they're all going to walk into the sunset together, but that's not quite exactly what happens. So then how do we deal with the day-to-day and the human interactions and the desires to be centered and powerful and to obey and to be humble, to do what you're asked and told to do? Those are the challenges that we get in this letter.
Because right here, the text is verses 10 through 18, 1 Corinthians chapter 1. But this is where you get the whole, it's been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is that each of you say, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. So there's lots of, it's almost like pre-denominational bickering going on here, and which
It
camp
is.
are you a part of, and all these things that are very much the water we swim in today, of Baptists versus Catholics versus
Right.
Presbyterians versus whatever.
Right.
This was all still there pretty much
It
on
was
day one, it seems.
It's all there. And I also think the opening, it has been reported to me how many times, right? Do we walk into each other's offices, or congregants come to us, or we go to congregants, or people are just talking back and forth and they're like, girl, I heard, or Jim told me, all of that, very human. This
Yeah.
is what I heard. This is what she said. Energy is in the church. And I think it's easy to read these biblical texts and think that everyone is praying and la 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 la, holy. But no, this is very real human
Yeah.
interaction here, and it's
We've
really great.
we've always been figuring this out. There was
Oh,
never a had it all together moment. It's always been adaptive and responsive to the
mhm.
real lives and real situations around us. And the reality is, probably the minute we figure it out, something happens, or someone new joins, or something changes, or someone just has an emotion, and then suddenly we have to adapt and respond again. And like you said, it's real life. That's what the church was then, and that's what the church in the world continues to be today.
Absolutely. And I think at at the foundational level, I don't know that we would have it any other way.
Yeah.
As challenging as it can be, particularly in a context like Riverside, where we have all the tribes and nations, metaphorically speaking, but people from all different walks of life, educational, political, social, ethnic, racial backgrounds. Um, it stirs up things. And what we see in this letter are all those tensions on full display. And tensions not necessarily in a bad way, but you're pairing and inviting community amongst people who just are different. And how do we do that? How do we be church in the midst of all this delicious diversity?
So one thing this text made me wonder, and perhaps you're going to
Mhm.
have to get like a little heresy stamp to put on me in a minute here. I wondered if the way that Paul is writing this with these questions of, you belong to Apollos, you belong to Seth, all these bickerings of people choosing who they, and Paul ends up saying, no, we all belong to the same source. It all comes from one. All these pieces build into it. Is it a stretch to apply that in our world today to kind of religious diversity, where we have so much bickering on, I'm a Christian and you're going to hell because you're not? Or could we say many different traditions and spiritualities are pointing in a similar, perhaps the same direction? And so our bickering is just getting in the way of the work we're called to do to heal our soul and heal the world. And maybe we need a Pauline letter to help us see our even faith diversities differently. Am I dabbling in heresy? You keep me in line, Pastor.
I mean, I think I'm in a similar place as you. I I don't think it's a stretch. I think it is a possible interpretation that the invitation is being extended to all, that the source, regardless of Apollo or Paul or whoever we're claiming, the source is still the same. So I think that's a legitimate bridge that you could draw from that to religious pluralism. I'm sure there are people who would, I was saying in virtual coffee hour last week, there are many good interpretations of a text. I remember a professor saying to us, "You can't make the Bible say anything, but you can make it say a lot of things, right? It doesn't say everything." So, when someone that takes a more conservative view of things, but when someone takes a more creative view, you can make that argument. So I think
Yeah.
yours is legit.
All right, I'll take it. I get to keep my job. I get to keep,
Yeah,
my clergy credentials. Collar is still here. All right, we're good to go.
right. At least at Riverside, if it were someplace else, you and I both know
Yeah.
that's not the traditional interpretation.
Which says something about just creating space for imagination. And even we don't all have to have a dogma that we're bound to, but there's this openness to explore and wonder, and curiosity and questions don't crumble at all. A friend of mine talked about, is your faith a wall made out of bricks where if you pull one out, the whole thing crumbles? Or is it a trampoline where you can take a spring off and look at it and the thing still bounces and you can replace them and build it differently? And yeah.
I like that. I like that. I also think like Legos, they've got those Lego sets that can make multiple things. And that's what I think about the text. Depending on how you're coming at it, where you are in your life, where the people you're serving among are, what's happening in the world. I mean, we just saw that with our Advent and our Lenten season. It was in dialogue with real life and the dynamics of real life. And so you see things that you have never seen before. And so that ability, as you said, to good seminary words, deconstruct and reconstruct your understanding of yourself as a living text, the Bible as a living text, and the world as a living, breathing, dynamic text is going to give you all sorts of possibilities for where this story can go.
And that's what we see. We're looking at Corinth. We're looking at a real living community. We think of it
Hmm.
as a static book that we've had our whole lives, but this was a letter written to people responding to particular things. And like I said earlier, there are 2 letters of Corinthians we have in our New Testament, our Christian scriptures, but scholars assume there are probably 4 based on textual evidences that they seem to be pointing towards. And First Corinthians actually was written after Second Corinthians. The ordering of the epistles, First Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, all those books that are attributed to Paul, they're listed in that order not because of chronology, but just
Right.
longest to shortest. So that's the logic behind that, which is why First Corinthians is listed before Second Corinthians, even though they were written in the opposite order. So someone needs to tell who wrote this Bible, God, to change that.
The other thing that I think is fascinating to remind ourselves about is that they're letters, right?
Yeah.
Paul was trying to get communities to figure out what it meant to be community together, and never intended, never expected that we'd be reading his letters thousands of years later. So when you think about the letters that you send to your mom, to your friends, if you even send letters anymore, maybe emails are more appropriate, or texts. Could you imagine someone collecting those things, putting them in a book
Yeah.
and calling them holy or calling them sacred? I had a professor who said, Paul might have been totally scandalized and felt incredibly violated, like his privacy had been intruded upon, to have
Yeah.
his things gathered in that way, studied in that way, and used as like dogma for the church.
Yeah.
It's kind of shocking. It's kind of wild. Yeah.
That's a great point. Just to remember the literary styles, contexts, constructs that we're reading. We see it all bound in the same pages, assuming it's all the same, but no, there is so many particularities just in the diverse types of literature. And yeah, imagine like getting to read those personal letters you wrote to a friend or a family. Suddenly they're put on display for everybody. Whew, that's an
Yeah.
interesting take on. That's just an interesting
Yeah.
reality
It's
of
like
what
no
this is.
pressure.
Yeah.
This is the word of God. No, that's my letter.
Oh, he's like, I would have said things so differently if I knew it was going to be read 2,000 years later. Yeah.
Right. In the way that we elevate it. Another interesting thing I'll say about Paul and his letters. I took a really wonderful Letters of Paul class in seminary, and the professor was saying that people in many churches, Paul is ascendant to Jesus. That there's more weight put on what he has to say than there is put on what Jesus has to say. And she just had us mull like why that might be the case. Where I landed, and I thought it was pretty good. Paul is very prescriptive, very do this, and it makes sense. Having not met Jesus, feeling a sense of having to hold a ragtag group of people together who are struggling and fighting, trying to stay under the radar of the Roman Empire. Christianity or people of the way were not the dominant religion, and so any sort of oddity with them, like women in leadership, which we read about in the Bible, if that had alerted the empire, I think there was a concern that the group could be destroyed or disbanded, and so he felt a need to keep them together, but also felt Jesus was coming back, like tomorrow, not like we don't know when. We're still waiting. So that colors and shapes things. And so he was saying, women, listen to your husbands, and women sit down and don't talk in church, because he's trying to keep the lid on this thing until Jesus gets back. Jesus, on the other hand, is very parabolic, asks questions. Well, what do if a camel goes through the eye of the needle, what are you talking about, Jesus? What does that mean? And I argue that people don't want to think that hard. They don't want to figure out from generation to generation what certain things mean, especially when we're afraid. And so Paul, I think, tells us what to do, and Jesus asks us, what do we should be doing? So you have to be, I think, courageous to follow Jesus. And I think Paul kind of gives you all the answers. It's kind of like a test, like a multiple choice test, whereas Jesus is kind of like, you're going to write an essay. And people are like, man, I don't want to figure that out.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Paul is kind of spoon feeding us what to believe and what to do. And Jesus is
Force
saying,
feeding.
all right, force feeding. And Jesus is saying, here's the pantry. Go grab some ingredients. Let's bake a cake.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe, or make something else. We're just going to, add a little sugar, add a little salt to the earth, everybody. Here we go. Yeah.
Right.
That approach.
Jesus gives you a framework, like you said, and it's like those baking shows where you've got these ingredients, and he's like, okay, what are you going to make? Paul's kind of like, follow these instructions or you fail.
Paul is like the purple carrot or green apron, where it's a prepackaged box with the ingredients and the recipe right there for you to just follow it exactly. Or it's like the microwave version of it all. All right, put it in, take it out, it's good to go. Which was, not to mention the particularities that Paul is writing to Corinth. Paul is writing to Rome. Paul is writing to certain spaces. And his letters are contextual, and then we lift it and paste it out of context 2,000 years later, when he wasn't writing us a letter. Not that we can't read it and learn from it, but we have to realize it wasn't written to us first. We have to, I was going to say, if I want to read it now, first I have to read it then. I have to understand a bit of who the audience was when this was first written for me to even have the ability to listen in and make sense of the metaphors and the language for my life today. Whereas Jesus,
Absolutely.
like you said, is parabolic, is speaking more broadly, still uses the context of his time. We need to know
Yes.
what, agrarian culture was like to understand his metaphors, but he's not writing a letter to as particular of a context as we see in Paul for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why we love
Oh,
his
well,
stuff.
that was good. I'm all this to say, I'm excited for where we're taking these. This is going to be a fun Sunday. Corinth, we got a lot. We didn't even talk about Priscilla and Aquila, who we meet in the text in Acts. There's a whole thing there on, the diversity of genders needed for this work of
Yeah.
God in the world. It's not just a boys' club, no matter how often we're the ones who seem to say it is. No, we need all genders to be a part of this, and all people who are called by God. There's a lot going on, but we'll get into more. We're gonna get into 1 Corinthians 13 next week. So leave a comment below if you're still watching, which some of you are. Leave a comment and say Paul wrote letters. Let that be the thing. That's a fun little random phrase to prove you're still listening. And I know some of you are going to do it. You're fantastic people who watch this show and engage with us. So leave your questions, comments about the text. Join us on Sunday to hear where this sermon shapes up. I think it's going to be fantastic. And we'll be back next week to talk about more 1 Corinthians. We'll see you then.